I'll be beginning each one of our sessions with a small devotional exercise. Now, the reason I'm going to do this is that there's a danger in us doing this course that we focus on theory, but we don't actually do anything. So I'll have the practice of beginning sessions with some I call a devotional exercise. And I want to begin today with what's a very simple but very fundamental stance devotionally. You remember last period, I spoke about the Christian spirituality is a matter of receiving. And that the discipline that's involved in Christian spirituality is not so much a discipline of doing, but it's a discipline of putting ourselves in a place where we are ready and open and willing to receive, the discipline of receiving. And the most important discipline of all for that is listening. 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 I don't know if you're like me, but the moment I get up in the morning, I switch on this computer up here. And sometimes I've had a bad night and the computer, in fact, has never been switched off all night. It's running all night, and that's a bad night when it's not switched off. But if I've had a good night, I switch the computer on. And immediately I start thinking, looking forward, planning, focusing on the day ahead. So I go into active mode. Even before I start work. The work starts up here. Now, what's the feature of that? Well, in that story, the story of my computer, if you like, my mind, the person who is at the center of everything? Me. I'm the actor, and things and people touch peripherally on me, but I am the main character. In fact, I'm the only character in the story of my day. I do the speaking, I do the thinking, I do the doing, I do. And that goes for the whole of my day until the evening, and I've got a certain routine at the end of the day which helps me to shut off that computer if possible. Does that sound familiar? Okay, now there's nothing wrong with that. That's the way God's designed us. But we need to be aware that that in itself is one of the big problems that we face in our spirituality. That we, in a sense, do the talking all the time. I don't know whether you're like me, but I talk even when I don't talk. The worst thing of all is that I talk even when you are talking. My listening is, in fact, talking up here. I don't really listen. And that's symptomatic of the way people respond to me. Do you know what the biggest complaint of my wife is about me? Guess. I don't listen. That's the second one. Just because he's got a good-looking wife.
Doesn't make him any prettier.
No. Do you know what I've heard from my kids again and again? Dad, you aren't listening. Oh, shut up. Don't preach at me. And I guess that's what you felt like saying in many occasions to me too. It's so hard to listen. And because we don't listen, what happens? We don't receive. Most of God's best gifts to us, at least spiritually, come not by means of the hands or the eyes, but through the ear. Okay, listening. I want to do a very simple listening exercise. And as an sort of a guidance in this exercise, I want to remind you of the story of the call of Samuel. You remember in 1 Samuel chapter 3, we have this story, and I'll read the story up to the point where I'm interested. Chapter 3, verses 1 to 10. Just listen to it. You don't have to look it up. It's fairly straightforward. The boy Samuel ministered before the Lord under Eli. In those days, the word of the Lord was rare. There were not many visions. One night, Eli, whose eyes were becoming so weak that he could barely see, was lying down in his usual place. The lamp of the Lord had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying down in the temple of the Lord before where the ark of the God was. Then the Lord called Samuel. Samuel answered, "Here am I." And he ran to Eli and said, "Here am I, you called me." And Eli said, "I did not call. Go back and lie down." So he went and lay down. Again the Lord called Samuel, and Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, "Here am I, you called me." "My son," Eli said, "I did not call you. Go back and lie down." Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord. The word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. The Lord called Samuel a third time, and Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, "Here am I, you called me." Then Eli realized that the Lord was calling the boy. So Eli told Samuel, "Go and lie down, and if he calls you, say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" So Samuel went and lay down in his place. The Lord came and stood there, calling as at the other times, "Samuel, Samuel." Then Samuel said, "Speak, for your servant is listening." Samuel didn't know the Lord. The Lord was speaking to him. He didn't recognize the voice of the Lord. Now, what I want you to do is the following, very simple. I'll have a prayer, and then I want you just to get relaxed, shut your eyes, and do nothing except listen. Listen. And as an active thing, just listen and receive all the sounds that surround us. There's one that's very obvious. Have you picked it already? The clock up there. But there'll be other sounds that you'll hear. So just listen. And then we'll do it for a period of time. And after listening, then have in your own heart say the prayer, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." I will close then at the end of the session with prayer. Okay. Let's pray. Lord God, we thank you that you speak to us. Speak to us now, for we are listening for you. Amen. Lord Jesus, our ascended Lord, let your word be a light for my feet and a lamp for my pathway today and always. Amen. Was that hard? Yes, you're nodding there.
I can't shut up. That's all. I just realised my brain doesn't quite. And I was talking in my head.
Yes.
And I kept having to say,
Shut up.
Stop.
Shut up. And that's the problem. It's not easy to switch off. And notice that I didn't tell you to switch off. Shut up. What did I tell you to do? Listen. Now, I could have gone forward and given you another instruction, which is, don't worry about your thoughts. Just let them come and let them go. But the end of each thought, go listening. And that illustrates exactly what the biggest problem we have is, we listen superficially, but we don't really hear. Did anything strike you about, as you were listening, just physically listening?
Buses.
Okay, what were the sounds you heard, besides the clock?
There's a big hop from up that direction.
Yes. Yes, from the building somewhere.
Yeah.
Righto. What else?
Computer buzz.
A continual buzz all the time, and initially it's an indiscriminate one, but when you start listening you can begin to separate what's contained in that buzz there.
You can hear the differences between the buses and
The buses and cars. What?
Just other cars. And
Other cars.
stuff.
There's just a car going, and cars stopping, cars starting, bus, what? Gear changes. What was an indiscriminate noise began to be distinguished. You got this, what was a mess became separated into different sounds. Besides, so there's that traffic noise, there's that there, just there's the clock. What else?
There is a computer or something.
What?
There's a computer or something.
There's a computer on over there with a faint little sort of a whir, buzz. What, sorry?
It's the fan of the computer. Yeah.
Is it the fan? Okay, there's a computer noise, which is just there.
I think there was a plane too. Right?
There was a plane, yes, but it wasn't directly over us. It was a little bit out. I don't know where it was because I had my eyes shut, but it seemed to be a little bit up out there.
I heard my stomach going.
Sorry, what?
I heard my stomach.
Yeah.
Here are also people's lips.
Yes.
Those were noises.
Did you hear people moving? There was a little bit of shuffling going on. Yes, Chris? Oh, sorry. I thought you had your hand up. And there was a funny thing that happened to me, which was, I don't know if you had it. I heard my pulse. I didn't only feel the pulse up here, but I heard it then. And something funny happened. That pulse gradually became synchronized to the
Yeah, so I was going to say,
Okay.
I was just saying that.
clock. Okay, very strange phenomena. Pulse, and that's, I'll be coming back to pulse in connection with certain aspects of spirituality, how important that pulse is as one of the basic rhythms of our bodily existence that we're unaware of most of the time. You know, we usually get the pulse like this. There's another thing that I heard, which I don't usually hear, which is the sound of my own breathing. Did you hear that? Just the sound of breathing.
That was the only breathing I could hear.
My breathing, was it?
No.
My breathing. At one point I was trying to hear other people's breathing, but I couldn't.
Yes.
I was
Yes.
interested that we got no sound from the rest of the building, like we got from that direction.
Yes.
But outside, like from that arc, nothing.
Apart from that pop there, and why was that? Because that's so strong. Now, can I generalise from this? And this illustrates once again something, just the way things are. We are surrounded by thousands of sounds. Yet most of the day, what happens? We don't hear them. And it's important that we don't hear them because we couldn't process them all. So what we do with our hearing is selective hearing. Most of you at least, are listening to me now, and it means if you listen to me, you don't hear other things usually, unless it's a really aggressive sound. But what does it mean practically speaking? We only actually receive a very tiny amount of the sound that surrounds us. And the same too with seeing. Do you realise how selective we are in what we see? Most of us don't notice the obvious stuff that's happening all around us. And we can't take it all in. We've got to focus on particular things. Now let me put something to you about our spiritual life. And that's this. That God is talking to us all the time. If I had ears to hear, I would not only hear my own voice, but I would really hear, not just register, but what other people are saying. Do you know what I mean? Because in most cases we don't really listen. We process a little bit of information that we need to get, and we don't really hear what that person is saying. If I had the ears of God, the ears of Jesus, I wouldn't just hear myself, but I'd hear what you were not just saying, but meaning. I would hear you. I would understand you. I would see you. But most of all, I would hear God. Not as an additional sound. Hear God where? Hear God inside here, through you and around you. What's the problem that I have? Why can't I do this?
You need to be selective, so you just select things out.
We
necessarily don't want to.
Yeah, there's a whole lot of things. Part of it is selectivity. Only hear certain things, and I don't hear other things. But it's not just a matter of practicality, but it's selectivity. There's something in me that filters out all sorts of stuff. We filter out negative information. Or unless we are depressed, then a depressive always does what?
Positives.
You hear the negative, but you don't hear the positives. Okay, it's funny the way we're wired. But the biggest blindness that we have is spiritual blindness. It's not just that we can't hear, but we don't want to hear. As, for example, negative information or positive information or whatever. And I don't know if you picked up in today's reading a wonderful phrase that Paul uses about the eyes of not your head being opened, but the eyes of your heart being opened. There's also the ears of your heart rather than just the ears of your head. Now, spirituality, the most important aspect of our spiritual life is learning to listen. Switching off in one way and going to another way. If I had, and it's not just a spiritual thing, it's a way we're constructed. Vaughan, you were saying about this business of not being able to get rid of thoughts. That's a common phenomena, but the one way if you try and stop thinking distractive thoughts, have you noticed something?
You're thinking about something.
You're thinking about something and it's counterproductive. In fact, it gets worse and worse. What's the secret of dealing with distracting thoughts? You know, the thoughts that come automatically. And they don't come, you know, it's not because somebody's talking to you. Those thoughts come from inside us. The Greek word for this is logismoi, trains of thought. Logos is word. Trains of thought. Logismos, logismoi.
Just let them come, and then at some stage they will just
Yeah.
not.
Can you hear? Just speak louder, please. So, yes.
Let them come, and after some time they will just not come anymore because this need is probably satisfied, or if you block them, it makes it worse because they want to come out.
Yes, if you block them, they get stronger and take over. But if you let them come and let them go, what happens? Gradually what?
They ebb.
They ebb. And you go, and if you go, stick with it long enough, then gradually you settle down and become still. If you know, people who study the brain actually can measure this, you switch off from, I forget which is which, alpha waves to, I think it's to beta waves activity. Alpha activity in the brain, it might be the other way around, but I think it's right. Alpha activity is, you know, active thinking. Beta activity is contemplative thinking. It doesn't mean that you are unconscious, but you go from active conscious to receptive consciousness. And that's marked by a sense of stillness and focussing down. And you know, thoughts will still come and go. Wes, I've got a grasshopper mind that races all over the place. You probably can tell this from the way I react. All the time, sparkling, all over the place. But what happens then? It slows down. Slows down.
You can focus.
See? And then once I've got that stillness, then I can focus and concentrate on something because I'm still and I'm ready to receive it. Now that's the way we're made. Does this sound familiar to you? Okay. Now the trick of it is to learn to be still. And this is not spiritual yet, this is just physical, mental stuff. To learn to be still, so you go from this alpha to the beta activity to receptivity. What? Is it? You've looked up the dictionary. I always get it wrong. So, beta activity is the active, alpha is the receptive. Thanks, Chris. Then what you can do then is when you reach that particular state, what can you do when you're in that state?
Receive.
Receive. So if you want to do meditation on the word, let's say, you've got a passage of scripture. Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. Okay, I wanted to get you a little meditation on that. Do you start off trying to meditate on that? What's the problem? You'll work at it. You'll do exegesis of it. You'll think about it. You'll analyse it. Am I right?
Why was Samuel wear the ark of...
Yeah. All sorts of questions, distractions. They are good questions. They're good questions, but they're the wrong questions for what you're doing. And that stops you from hearing God's voice and for you to focus on receiving what God wants to say to you. Now, one of the things I'm going to emphasize over and over again is that the spiritual life is the life of reception. I'm going to talk about the gift of meditation, the gift of prayer. Everything is a gift, and learning to receive things as a gift rather than trying to produce stuff out of yourself from your inside. It's to receive things in your center rather than produce stuff from the center of your being. Being in a receptive mode or character. Anything else on that before I close that up and deal with a much more practical issue? What I'd like you to do is just to do this occasionally. You know, there's times in your day when you can just be. 5-10 minutes, you're on a bus or you're waiting for something, just to practice the art of listening. Just listen. And the best thing is to concentrate physically on listening at something and letting the thoughts come, letting the thoughts go, letting the mind race, not picking them up, not running with it, but just letting it come and go, and learning then to settle down. It's a bit like water. One of the pictures that teachers of meditation go again and again is say, okay, if you get a rushing stream, okay, the water's muddy, it's churned up, okay, and the sunshine reaches the surface of the water. But what has to happen to the water before the sunshine can reach right down to the bottom of the water? It has to settle. The mud has to settle. The water has to become still. And if the water becomes still, then the sunshine fills the water. That's a picture that's used again and again by teachers of meditation, is to reach that stillness, to receive the light. Let it shine into you. Now, I could have done the same exercise by looking, but that's much harder. That's further down the road. Is practice, learn to, instead of just listening, practicing by looking at one thing and one thing only, and doing the same thing. Now, some of you will be able to do that easier than the listening one, but I find that most people are better at the listening one. Okay? Yes?
I just find that sometimes I'm physical. I just like moving all the time.
Yes.
I listen well when I'm moving sometimes.
Yes.
Everything's active and it's going.
Yes. Yes.
Or at least I engage. And so to switch off, I think it's concentration and physical. And I just often, it's a silly game, but I just pretend there's some sort of criminal in the room who's out to get me. And he's completely dependent on a motion sensor to see me. And I just have to evade it. And it doesn't actually make me stiff, because you can't hold stiffness for very long.
That's right.
It just makes me completely just
Relaxed.
Relax.
Yes.
And hold it.
Hold it.
And after, it only takes...
Or it's just resting, and it's not so much holding it, but just
right,
resting.
exactly.
It's like floating in water.
Yeah, if you hold it, you're in trouble, because you
Yes.
can't hold it for long.
Yes.
But you rest, and that's a good window for me to then move on to listening in with my inner self.
Yes.
But that's just how I work.
Yes. Now, one of the things that illustrates too, and all this illustrates, is that when it comes to meditation and prayer, you get a combination of three different things. It's physical, but it's also mental, and it is spiritual. You can't have any of these without the other. And a lot of the problems that we have in meditation and prayer are not spiritual ones, they're not even mental ones, they have to do with physical stuff, physical interference. Okay, I'll draw the line there, and I'm going to draw some practical implications from that after the break. But before the break then, I want to talk a little bit about the assignments that I've set you to do, if you don't mind. Of course you mind. Evaluation of a book. Could you please, during the break, if you've already some of you have emailed and I've sent you questions, let me know if you've decided what book you want to do, and I'll either give you a print-off version or a electronic version of the questions on the book. You don't have to do, it's up to you when you do it. But if you want to get started, the sooner the better. Any questions on that first assignment? Now, I want just two things in that first assignment, evaluation of book. It's partly, let me put it up front. I've given you this so that you will read some major work on spirituality. And not just abstractly, but so that you'll apply it and learn what you can from it. So to read it and to learn from it. So you hear some other point of view besides mine on this topic. The second topic is much more, needs a bit more explaining. Could you open your Bibles to Proverbs 20, verse 5? Proverbs 20, verse 5, where we find the NIV translation that I have goes the following way: the purposes of a man's or a person's heart are deep waters, but a man or person of understanding draws them out. Actually, the Hebrew is not the purposes, but the counsel, the purpose, singular. The etzah. The etzah, singular. The purpose of a person's heart is deep waters. Now, etzah is primarily advice. Now, advice is that which determines what you do, determines your behaviour. So, etzah is advice, counsel, and it's practical advice. It's never theoretical. So, telling you what to do, planning what to do. It could be the plan of a person's heart is deep water. The advice, you could also translate purpose, but not purpose in an abstract sense, but the goal of your behaviour, what you're working for. Now, is deep water, you get the picture of a what? A well, exactly right. And it's a well that's not shallow, but is very, very deep. Now, a man, a person of understanding, draws it out. Now, drawing out, the picture is of people didn't have reservoirs and pipelines. If you wanted water, you had to go to the well and you drop a bucket in the well and you draw the water out of the well. You get that picture, drawing out water from the well to drink or to use. Now, the picture here isn't drawing water from the top of the well, but drawing water where? From the very bottom of the well. And what's the well that you're drawing water from? The heart. Now, for modern people, us modern people, heart is basically the seat of the emotions. But it's broader here. In Hebrew, the heart is, or everywhere in the ancient world, the heart is the centre of the person. It includes the emotions, the mind, the self, the inner self. So the heart of a person, the core of that person's being. Now, that's the superficial proverb. What do you think this proverb is saying?
There's a lot of things that we've got buzzing around, but person understanding can decipher and draw out the right one.
For whom? It doesn't say. What do you think? No. Okay, the purposes, the plan, let's say the counsel of a person's heart is deep water, but a man, a person of understanding, draws it out. Now, there's two possibilities. It's either the person does it for themselves or somebody else does it for them. Which do you take it, Julie?
Depending on what you need it to be.
Okay, depending on what you need it to be. You could take it either way. Now, for the purposes of this exercise, I want to take it as somebody else, and that's my experience. Do you know what the biggest problem is that you'll face in counselling people, ministering to people? If you haven't already discovered it, that we assume in our society that people understand who? Themselves. Do you realise most people, most of us, haven't got a clue of what makes us tick? What's going on around us? For us to discover, if you like, our own story, what do we need? Sorry?
Someone else to help us, who sees us as well.
Somebody who knows us, who sees us, to help us to understand our story. Now, what's the picture here of drawing out?
Bringing out the things that are not particularly obvious.
Because you see, not the stuff on the surface of the water, not just below the surface, but to get to the bottom.
That stuff on the top and just below is the easiest stuff.
That's the easy stuff. You see it.
Stuff down the bottom is...
Yep. And the stuff at the top actually is distracting. You think, I know. But in most cases, it'll lead you on a wild goose chase. And in any case, most people don't present a smokescreen to other people. There's things that are kept hidden. Or even, that's too deliberate. In most cases, people aren't even aware of what's down the bottom. Now, how do you, in practical terms, well, I'd say counselling, pastoral care is, if I can get two things, is basically getting other people to tell their story. It's as simple as that. Getting other people to tell their story. That's what the rest of your life's going to be, if you're going to be good pastors, good counsellors, is getting people to tell their story. And how do you get people to tell their story? How do you draw out the story? What kind of listening?
Responsive listening.
Yeah, responsive listening.
Responding back to them that you're hearing.
You're hearing, yes. And how do you do that? What's the way of getting people to open up? So how do you draw out people? And what kind of questions, Chris?
Relative questions?
Yeah, and what are they? No, there's a certain kind of question and you've been on the receiving end of it. Somebody asks you a question, and what does that question do? It shuts you up. What kind of questions actually invite you to... Open-ended? Well, you know your psychological theory. Well, and it's partly that, the kind of open-ended questions. Is it just technically is it just certain class of questions, getting your questioning technique right? My kids hate that kind of technique because we live in a psychologizing thing, and particularly I've got some nephews and nieces whose mother is a social worker, and they tell her whenever she uses active listening techniques, "Don't work us, Mum." Does that ring a bell? There's a certain technique thing. What kind of, it's open-ended. I just want you to spell that out. Julie, what do you say?
If you show an interest in them by letting them know that you care.
Yes.
And that through your caring you want to know more about them.
Yes.
And through the different types of questions that you ask, people will naturally open up.
They'll naturally open up if they know you care, you're interested in them, you're sympathetic, you're empathetic, you are compassionate, all those kinds of things, that you care. But most of all, that you're interested in not the result, not interested in getting something out of them, but interested in them. Now, I was going to say, you can draw people out and you can get their story if you get their story, you won't only get their story, but whose story will you discover?
Your own.
Your own story. Because always as you're listening, you will, by getting them to tell their story, you will have some understanding of your own story, your own, what makes you tick, what lies down deep inside you. You'll begin to make sense of stuff that you haven't been able to make sense of in your life. That's if you have learned to draw people out. And it goes deeper than that. Because the purpose, at least spiritually speaking, of your pastoring people is not just to get them to tell their story, but to get them to see how their story fits in with God's story of them. Can I give you an illustration? And this is an analogy, not an illustration actually. If you wanted to know my story, just not spiritually, but just as a person, you'd not only have to get to know my story, but whose other story would you have to get to know? Claire's. Righto? And the kids. And my parents and siblings. Okay? Because they are part of my story. Can you see that? My story doesn't make sense by itself. It makes sense as part of these other stories. Now, spiritually speaking, yeah, our spiritual story involves all of those, but what's the other dimension to it? To see the hand of God in your life. To see God. You see, the problem is that we live most of our lives and we aren't aware of what?
God's presence. God's
presence and activity, involvement with us. And partly the problem is that we don't see it when it's happening. I mean, at the moment, you are not aware of what God's doing at this instant in your life. The only way that you get some sense of discerning the hand of God, hearing the voice of God in your heart, in your life, is not when it happens, but hindsight. Okay, now, what I want you to do is to interview one chosen person. To get them to tell their story in one or two areas, either the story of what's most significant in their spiritual life, or else the story of their devotional life, just their life of prayer, meditation. Now, there's a couple of things that I want you to be quite clear about. The most difficult thing is going to be to choose the person and to confront the person, because what reaction are you likely to get? Ben, can you anticipate? You say, you come to me, you want to interview me.
What have I got to tell you?
Yeah, you're a seminary student there. What have I got to tell you? Why will that my initial reaction be? That? What?
It's defensive, you don't want to really open up.
Number one, it's defensive, I don't want to open up.
Particularly if you say what it's for.
What?
Particularly if you say what it's for.
If you say what it's for, yep.
It could be guilt.
It could be guilt. Yeah. Any other reasons why people be reluctant to get involved?
You're going to grade me on my... You're going to grade me on my journey?
Yeah, you're going to grade me. Now, am I half spiritual, medium spiritual? You know, is it fail, pass one, pass two? I mean, pass two, pass one, credit, distinction. Are you going to grade me, assess me? Yep.
Also, it's manufactured. Like Julie was talking about it, these things come out when you love someone,
yes,
when you care for them.
Yes.
And if this is done in a context of assessment, or even outside of just an organic
yes,
relationship of love
yes,
and care, then
it's unnatural.
It's very difficult to do.
Yeah. And particularly when you get, there's another aspect, that's very, very strong, there's another aspect too. Most people would, if you confront them, would say, don't interview me, go and interview somebody else. Why? Because I'm not good enough. I'm not spiritual enough. My life's really rather boring. I've lived a very ordinary life. It's on. Now, you're likely to get all sorts of prickly reactions initially, now, which means that the way you approach people has to be very, very careful, and you have to be upfront about what you are doing. And I'd suggest is that the basic way you put it is not so much that you are doing an assignment, number one, but that you want to, as the assignment writing it, but this is part of the exercise of this course here in spirituality, which is part of your training to be a pastor or a counsellor or whatever the case may be. It's training. And the purpose of it is just to do what? Not to write an assignment, but to explore, to what? To listen, to
know them.
To get to know them. To get to know them. Now, do you realise that for most people in our church, nobody has ever asked them to tell their story? And because nobody's asked to tell them story, they've never told their story to themselves. They haven't even looked at their story. It's a book that's closed. It's a book that's closed. They've never read it. Be upfront. And then secondly, also make it quite clear that you're not doing a transcript of this, but that the report that you'll be giving is just an analysis of what the data and is anonymous. So please write it up in such a way that I cannot identify who you are talking about, even if it means switching sexes or stuff like that. You need to be very, very careful because there's issues of confidentiality here, and this is part of your training in confidentiality. And what I've also suggested to people in the past is that you give them the option of reading your thing before you submit it. Now, why would that be useful?
Peace of mind.
Right?
Peace of mind for them.
Peace of mind for them, and they can challenge you and you can correct it, number one. Yep. Anything else?
They might have more for you.
They might have more for you. Number two?
I'm interested in what you've heard.
They're interested in what you've heard. And they will get back to you and they'll say, look, I don't think you've understood me. I think you misrepresented me. But they're also interested in hearing your account, what you heard about their story. Why they're interested in what you heard about their story?
Because people are interested in what other people think and know of them.
Yeah. And that's the way we get to know ourselves. Right? So this is, it's a very simple exercise on the face of it, but I regard this as one of the most important things that you'll be doing for me this course. And it's way beyond our spirituality course. It's part of your general training in this whole thing. One final thing, and then open for questions before we take a break. I've been asking students to do this for a number of years, and with a few exceptions, there's always exceptions. Guess what the reaction of most people is at the end of this exercise? Not of students, but of the people being interviewed.
I'm sorry it's not good enough if you don't like me.
What?
I'm sorry that it's not good enough, perhaps.
No.
I reckon thank you.
Why?
I don't know, I just reckon it would be a pretty, especially for older people, if
Yes.
no one's ever asked them their story, they've
Yes.
never had the opportunity to talk to someone about it.
Yeah.
It'll be like, wow, I didn't know that's what people saw of me.
It's not only, wow, I didn't know that's what people saw of me.
God's impact on my life and where He's been.
Is far bigger than I ever realised. It's a kind of a wow, it's a gratitude thing, saying, look, I'm not, I didn't realise, it's just looking back, I realise now why that's so important in my life. I realise what God was doing there. It's never occurred to me before. I can see my story they've usually got bits and pieces of their own story, but what have they got missing is the way it all hangs together and the way God has been acting in their lives. Almost all, without exception, are immensely grateful because they realise that their lives, which they consider to be most insignificant, in fact are immensely significant. Do you understand what I'm saying? And that's the thing about the spiritual life. It's hidden. And the most extraordinary people in the church are, in fact, which people?
Ordinary people.
The ordinary people. And that's what I've learnt to my own shame.
The Dow Norwegian Lutherans.
Yes, the Peterson's article there. They are the ones that are, and you get, that they have deep waters. They look boring, they look dull, they seem to have lived boring lives, but if you look closely at anybody's life, there's never anybody ever lives a boring life. Their life is rich and full, not from a human point of view, but from God's point of view. Okay, that's the exercise for that. Any questions on that? I've taken some time because it's a delicate exercise, but can you see that just from your point of view, you can learn a lot about yourself by doing this, as well as learning to see learning to be a spiritual director. Now, spiritual director doesn't mean telling people what to do. What does being a spiritual director mean?
Walking with them.
Walking with them, drawing out what's already there. Yes?
Just if you could give a couple words on suggestions for, because like you said, one of the toughest things will be finding out who to interview. And I know that you can't have any hard, fast rules in this, but are there any things that you would just recommend in order to hone our search down immediately to...
Well, I would suggest the following things. Number one, interview an old person. Why an old person? They've had a lot of experience and they can see life as a whole. And that's important for you because most of you are at the first part of your life and you need to have a sense of what life looks back as a whole rather than looking forward to what lies ahead. Right? Old person, number one. Number two, and this is going to be a bit difficult, a person of the opposite sex. Why?
I naturally want to do a man.
I know, that's what I say. These are mere suggestions. Tom, why do you naturally want to be a man, apart from your general misogyny?
Because I suppose it's closer to my story, it's closer to me.
Yes.
It's less foreign, it's more digestible, it's more understandable, it's more...
Yes. Well, granted all that, why do I suggest that you do the opposite sex?
Because you don't understand them.
Because you don't understand them, because they're different, therefore you can learn
Much
more. But there's going to be difficulties. Watch out for the sexual issues that come in. But I don't think for an older woman that's likely to be a problem. Yes, I don't want you guys to interview young chicks. Okay, so an older person of opposite sex. The third thing that I'd say is a person to a different place to you. Now, you are something of an intellectual, therefore, what kind of person would I suggest you interview?
If you walk down London Street.
Yeah, 3 o'clock in the morning.
A hands-on person.
A practical person. A practical person, not an intellectual.
Yeah.
A person who's different to you. If you do, let's say you decide to interview a pastor, but not a pastor that your kind of pastor, but a pastor who's different to you, a practical, unintellectual kind of a pastor. Yes, Tom?
Could it be someone who, say, is in their 70s but only became a Christian in their 50s?
Of course. Or even just 1 or 2 years. Now, this might sound odd. A recent Christian. Why? Because the temptation for that person is to think God has been at work in which part of my life?
Past 2 years only.
Sorry?
Yeah, only the past 2 years.
The last 2 years. But where does God start working in a person's life? Only when they become a Christian? The most significant parts, and Maria, you probably know this because you weren't raised a Christian. Anybody here who wasn't raised a Christian? No. Okay. One of the things that happens, and I've heard this story again from many people, was there was a song back in the 70s. It might have been Jesus, but I just didn't know, was the refrain of it. The sense that, by becoming a Christian, you have, but this is not the first time that he's touched me. It was way back then, but I didn't realise it was him. Like, remember Samuel? He heard the voice, but he didn't yet know the Lord. And so he didn't recognise the voice there. And it's much more subtle. The activity of God in us once we become Christians is more overt than beforehand. And so, yes, in fact, it would be good to interview a person, if particularly you've been grown up in a Christian family, so to hear a different story and to push them and just to probe in a gentle way for them to reflect on how God might have been at work a long time before they became a Christian, in their parents, in their marriage, or whatever, the workplace, or whatever the case may be.
It's interesting, it becomes more obvious in that time than it does when you're...
Sorry, what?
It becomes more interesting in the previous history of your life before your baptism than when it is once you're baptised.
Why, you're talking from your own experience?
Yes.
Why is that, Michael?
That's just the reality.
Yes.
Yeah, and that's quite challenging because you think, how did I miss it?
Yes, how did I miss it?
Because it's so obvious.
Yes, once afterwards, looking back. Yeah. Does this resonate what I've been talking about with you?
Yes, very much.
Does it, Maria, does it resonate? Okay. Now, I don't suggest that you pick these two guys. I want you to get somebody outside of our community too. That's the last thing.
I'm not old.
Yes, you're still unfinished business. Any other questions just on that?
Outside
ALC community.
Yeah.
And outside your own family, that kind of thing. So, but look, I'm not telling you it has to be these things. These are my recommendations for your benefit. But you have to operate within your comfort zone. Yes, Julie?
I was just wondering, can it be of a different denomination?
Yes, of course. God's work is not restricted to the Lutheran Church or the Catholic Church. Right. Any other questions on that?
What about writing it up?
Writing it up. Now, I don't want you to write a transcript of the interviews, but I want you to analyse it. And to get the data, you can take your notes, but then to summarise, as far as I can gather, let's say it's a spiritual story. This is the person, this is where they are. As far as they're concerned, these have been the most significant events or persons or whatever experiences in their life. And then explain why it's been significant. One of the interesting things is, with people, is, and this is very important for spirituality, is that God has made each one of us different, and it means that every person's story is going to be different. And if you want to understand something of the riches of God's grace, you will need to listen not just to one or two stories, the story of a Luther or an Augustine, real dramatic stories they are, but you need to hear this many stories as possible. And when you get to my age, pray God you'll get much older than that, what will surprise you is the diversity of the ways, not just diversity of people and experiences, but the different ways in which God works in different people. There's no uniformity of experience. Now, I'm going to come back to that. There's no uniformity of experience. There's no basic set pattern. Even with conversions, there's certain things in common for all people who convert, but if you listen to the details of the story, no two stories of conversion are ever the same. Yes, I'm going over. Do you mind that? Because I'll just finish this here then. Yeah.
No, it's okay.
No, just finish it. Go on.
I was just saying, first of all, is it okay to then use a certain poetic language when we're talking about it? Like,
That's
rather than just dot point lists of this is the...
I don't want dot points. I want you to make sense of it.
Yes.
And not for yourself, but for me, the reader. First of all, to help them to make sense of it, and then you make sense of it, and then as an exercise in communication. Now, do you know what it is that I'm going to mark? I'm not going to mark that person's story. I'm not going to mark your understanding of that person, but I'm going to mark your essay. So just mark it as an essay, not the content.
Yes. But I mean, like rather than an introduction and a building the argument and a conclusion, I just feel like this could just have a different flavour to it.
It could be. I've had in the past where a person doesn't actually tells the story as a kind of a biography of that person. So not an essay in that sense, but an analytical biography. And not the obvious thing. One of the best I received didn't start off, birth, going the chronological story, but focused on one event in that person's life and told the story from that one key event. Can you see what I'm saying? It's a kind of, it was a kind of a short story that was then told. Yes, you can write a short story. A poem would be very difficult for me to analyse.
Poem, but more poetic language at least.
Of course. Well, that's, say, short story kind of thing, if you wanted to go that way, but you don't have to go that way. Chris, do you have your hand up? No. Okay, let's have a break.